presentation segment. We'll try our best to get through as many questions as possible. All right, so I'm going to disappear now. Dagan, over to you.
Well, good morning. Hope everyone can hear me. Darren, I'll get you to give me a shout if I go mute for some reason. So I'm an entomologist at Forest Research, and I specialise on wood and bark boring beetles. And the reason for that is that amongst them, they include what I consider to be probably the most important insect pests, forest insect pests, and real tree killers amongst them. So there are many forest pests, unfortunately, and it's the invasive ones that typically are the most damaging. And of those, the real tree killers do tend to be wood and bark boring beetles. So I'm gonna sort of give you a quick overview of some of the things that we're concerned about, some of the things that we're currently working on, a little bit of the research that we do here, and things to look out for the future. So a quick recap of why invasive species are so important, and it's really because they're capable of eating, competing, or hybridizing with native species, and thereby influencing the loss of either native species within the new region or disrupting ecosystem services. And as I just mentioned, most serious pests and diseases of trees and forests all over the world are non-native, so they're invasives. So these are pathogens, which is not my field, but I'm very aware of them, and hopefully you are too. So this includes Dutch elm disease, which was a fungus, which it's still out there and preventing any young elms from growing over a certain size. We've got Dothystroma needle blight, which is very damaging on pines. It's put a moratorium on planting of Corsican pine, for example. Ash dieback, you'll know about, it's everywhere. And Phytophthora ramorum, which is, it's called oak dieback in North America. It affects oaks over there, but here it kills larches on a very large scale. So here's a couple of high-profile invasive forest pests that we have in the UK, which you've probably seen. So horse chestnut leaf miner, it's a very interesting one. Tiny little moth. It has tiny little flattened larvae, these essentially caterpillars, and they feed within the epidermis of the leaves. So on the left, these pictures are typical of what you see in conker trees by sort of mid to late summer now. Actually, they don't kill the tree, so they're very becoming quite ugly, and they're actually relatively easily controlled by sweeping up leaves underneath the trees, but they're not tree killers. Oak processionary moth, Sharon's going to say something about these after me. The real risk from them is as a human health perspective. They cause these irritating lumps because of these sort of toxic hairs that they have, these very small toxic hairs. But I'm going to pass on to those. This again was quite high profile a few years ago. This is Asian longhorn beetle, and this is an Asian beetle which was accidentally introduced actually all over the world. It's appeared in many places in Europe and North America. It was brought into the UK in probably the early 2000s. In fact, in wood packaging material around to stone importers. So it was around this kind of stone that you see down in the bottom corner, and the larvae feed in this rough bit of crate wood, and as they emerge as adults, they then attack a very wide variety of broadleaf trees. And you can see up here a tree that's been heavily attacked. This is a North American, it's the type of maple, and it's had a lot of emerging adults. So really big problem, and actually very difficult to get rid of. Typically, most invasive species are not detected until they've been in the country for a decade or so, and that was true in this case. We were quite fortunate, actually. It was quite restricted in its distribution, and so we were able to eradicate it relatively rapidly. So there was a lot of surveying, and that was by the whole sort of DEFRA family. all the different agencies involved. Really good kind of response, but ultimately it led to destruction of a lot of host trees and potential host trees. So every time you find an infected tree, you have to then kill an infested tree, I should say. You have to then cut down and burn any potential host tree within 100 meters of that tree. And so, of course, every time you find another one, the radius that you're working on keeps increasing. So the final tally was 2,000 felled trees, including 600 in private gardens. And that was an issue in itself. You can imagine, of those, 66 were actually infested of 10 different tree species. But the important thing is, in the UK, we managed to declare it eradicated. We had follow-up surveys over the next 4 years. And the reason for this is that the ecology of this species means that it has quite a long life cycle. So it was actually, in the UK, it was up to 3 years, which meant that it wasn't spreading very far or very fast. Whereas in the UK, in places like Italy and places in North America, where they have quite hot summers compared to us, it was driving the life cycle, and they were going through much faster and spreading much further. So this is really the nub of my talk, I suppose, these bark and ambrosia beetles, and this is what I've spent most of my time working on over the last few years. And that's really because, again, amongst them, they include really, really significant forest pests with the capacity to kill mature trees. They're very small, typically. They're easy to transport in wood packaging material, in timber, particularly with bark on. And as climate is sort of warming and we have more and more stress of trees, the trees become susceptible to attack by insects just like this. So many of them are secondary pests, but with a pre-stressed tree, they can become absolute tree killers. So the US, for example, has 58 exotic bark and wood ambrosia beetles established in its forests now. In Europe, we have over 20. But in the UK, we had only 1 recorded. And I was slightly suspicious of this. I was wondering, had anyone really looked for it? And so one of my underlying factors was to try and determine if there were species out there we didn't know about. And this is one of the reasons we really struggle to find these, is some of them are very, very small. But it's not, in this case, it's not the size that matters, it's the numbers. So the abundance can build up very, very large, in fact. And this is how they spread. So up in the top left-hand corner, this is an infested young tree that's been brought over, and you can just about see these tiny little exit holes that the adults, indicating they're adults emerging from. Very, very easy to miss. This is actually an oak processionary moth egg plaque, greatly magnified. These are very easy to miss, and that's how oak processionary moth got into the UK. Infested timber, wood with bark on it, and we're also worrying more about wood chips these days for biofuel. So bark and ambrosia beetles, they both utilize fungi. They both have interactions to a greater or lesser extent. But the key to ambrosia beetles is they actually vector a fungus, which they then feed on. So it's kind of an obligate food source, in fact. So the beetle in the bottom corner is an ambrosia beetle, and you can see where it's inoculated this fungus into a gallery, and this is the mother. These are her eggs, and as the eggs hatch, both the larvae and the adults will feed on this fungus that she's brought with them. So they're true fungus farmers. Actually very interesting. Whereas bark beetles, they're feeding in that soft, nutritious phloem tissue underneath the bark here. And the key to ambrosia beetles is they actually move into the wood itself. So they inoculate the fungus in the timber itself, whereas the bark beetles are on the edge under that phloem tissue. And so I mentioned about them carrying fungi. Here's some examples. So they stain fungi. They carry these blue stain fungi, many beetles, which can be a problem, economic problem to timber being produced. Dutch elm disease we mentioned earlier. It was an invasive fungus, but it was carried by a native beetle, which feeds essentially on the twigs. Maturation feeds on the twigs of elm trees. This is this very, very small species, which I showed you earlier. This carries thousand cankers disease, very nasty disease on walnut. It's in North America quite badly. It's now been introduced into Italy and we think is spreading. And this is laurel wilt in Florida is horrendous. It's killing thousands, hundreds of thousands of trees. And this is an Asian species that's fought a symbiotic fungus, which has turned out to be very, very pathogenic. So this is the problem with invasives. Once they arrive, you don't know what the interaction is going to be or how damaging. And some of these bark beetles, they have real landscape level impact. So this is Ips topographus. This is actually a native to Europe, and you can just see that these are spruce trees. Once they get stressed, the insects can attack them. So drought stress drives these outbreaks. The trees are weakened effectively, and the insect can effectively just multiply and attack these otherwise healthy trees. These are both, the bottom examples are both North American. So mountain pine beetle, this is probably driven by climate change, we think, absolutely landscape changing. It's killed billions of trees of native lodgepole pine in British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest, really nasty. And here's this is a nice picture of an outbreak sort of spreading, essentially. This is a southern pine forest in the southern states. So my research over the last few years was to sort of survey to see if we had any alien scolites, alien bark beetles we didn't know about. I targeted 3 important forest types, oak, pine, and spruce. So pine and spruce are the most important sort of forestry production type forests, which obviously we have an interest in the Forestry Commission. Oak is the most biodiverse forest. And I looked at high-risk forests near to ports which bring in timber and forest products. And really, this was about developing a baseline of what we have in the UK, and then from there we can monitor, how it spreads, how damage might alter. And I was also interested in the fungi that they're carrying, so I modified my traps accordingly. And here's a trap up in the corner. They've got a lure which the beetle, effectively it's mimicking a stressed tree. So the beetles fly to the lure and they crash into the baffles in this trap and then drop into collecting fluid at the bottom. So it's fairly simple, but very effective. And I trapped right across the UK, Scotland, Wales, and England. Essentially, this is what comes out of your trap. So you can see the pot here with unsorted beetles. You have to sort of pick them out. And believe it or not, in this Petri dish, there's at least there's about 15 different species of bark beetle. So you need a good microscope and a good key. But actually, we don't have that many sort of native species. We have about 60 or 70 native species of bark beetles. And once you get to know them, they're relatively straightforward. And so seek and you shall find. Unfortunately, I found 3 new species of ambrosia beetles. These are the ones that carry a fungus with them, new to the UK, which we didn't know previously that we had. 2 of them are Asian, and 1 is North American originally. And the interesting thing is, they were all present in southeast England, where it's warmest. And it's also close to the continent, and that's I think an important factor. And of them, we're quite lucky. 2 of them are relatively benign. I should say actually they are very benign. The oak species, the middle one, which is Cyclorhipidion, it really just attacks. It's a decomposer. It attacks fallen oak boughs that are dying off. But of them, there was one species, Xylosandrus germanus, which is actually a very widespread pest in Europe and North America. So perhaps it was time that we got it. This one is something to watch. So it's not causing damage at the moment, but the key to it is that the fungus that it carries is very sort of polyphagous. That means it can attack and grow on very, very many hosts. So there are over 200 known hosts of 51 plant families known, and anything that the fungus can feed on, this bark beetle can get going in essentially. And that means that it's been able to attack typically stressed nursery trees, stored timber, both pine and oak, for example, and it's also attacked stressed beech trees in Belgium, grapevine in southern Europe. I mean, it goes for all sorts of things. So we do have it. It is spreading. At the moment, it's not causing any problems, but it's something to watch under climate change as plants become more stressed. So the other thing that probably the most important takeaway message is that actually there are gaps in our plant health regulations, and in particular, when we bring timber into the UK, we produce a lot of timber, but we import far more. We have to, the regulations say that we have to debark conifer wood, but we don't have to debark broadleaf timber. And so this broadleaf timber carries both bark beetles potentially under the bark here and ambrosia beetles, which are in the wood itself. So even debarked conifer wood can carry ambrosia beetles, because these are the ones that inoculate their fungus actually into the timber. And of course, there are relatively weak regulations on importing plant material for plants for planting. So small trees, you can just see here, these are ambrosia beetles pushing out, we call them noodles, but they're pushing out basically sawdust as they sort of burrow into the wood itself. And something to say is that there are very many other invasive species out there which we don't know. They cause minor problems elsewhere, but if we were to import them here, these are just a few for oak that we are on our watch list, as it were. Here's another one. I'm just going to whiz through a couple of other examples. This thing, again, is an Asian species, been accidentally introduced into Israel, California, and South Africa. It's another one that the fungus grows on all sorts of species. So it attacked over 200 different woody species in one botanical garden in California, and that included European species of tree, oak, plane, willow, beech, birch. And basically this fungus it carries is very pathogenic. So I think the message with this one and some of the others are actually that we still benefit from these relatively cool summers that we have in the UK. This thing is unlikely to be able to establish, and I think that's good news. But again, as the climate warms and certainly international trade allows more and more of these things to be sort of brought in, that the odds of these things arriving are increasing, or species arriving which actually will do well in the UK. There are bugs as well. This is oak lace bug. It's in Europe and spreading. The larvae, the nymphs rather, and the adults sort of feed by stabbing the plant cells, if you like, with their little proboscis. And they cause these chlorotic regions, these sort of yellowing regions. And again, we don't know at the moment how much damage they're doing to oak trees. But again, the highest risk of them getting to the UK is on infested plants and plant material. And oaks, as Sandra will tell you in a little while, oaks are really under stress in the UK. So this is not something we want. Now, my talk would have finished there previously, but sadly, after my survey, we found another bark beetle, an invasive. This is that European one that attacks spruce trees. We found it down in Kent. This is typically how it attacks. It builds up on fallen plant material or very stressed, drought-stressed material, and then starts attacking live trees. And as I said, it's not all about size; it's about abundance. And this is a picture from the Czech Republic. And these are individual beetles which have been collected by traps. I mean, there are millions there, tens of millions of beetles. And it really is about very large numbers. But you can't trap them out. You can trap as many as you can, and the population will still keep growing, unfortunately. So we have it. This was a tree. This is sort of how it presents, a red top spruce. When you start looking closer, the holes we saw actually, these are, this is woodpecker holes. The woodpeckers are feeding on larvae which are developing under the bark. This is the maternal gallery, so it's the mother makes the gallery laying eggs as she goes, and the larvae feeding under the bark. They eventually girdle the tree. And this site actually is relatively close to the Kent coast, and we have suspicions that they're starting to fly across. And we're doing some work to establish what the source of these beetles is. Because it's on an isolated site, actually we've again risen to the challenge very rapidly, again with Forestry Commission and DEFRA partners. And we're trying to eradicate this site. I think actually we're on track to do that. But if they're continuing to be seeded from across the channel, well, we'll see. You know how successful this will be. But we have to try, because it's a very important thing. We grow a lot of Sitka spruce in this country. So one of my research areas is actually to understand, will it attack Sitka? And so this is my lab. We've got a quarantine lab. And I'm rearing them on different spruce billets. We've done some work in the field here, and we're essentially sort of breeding them in the lab under quarantine conditions to sort of see how they do. And we can measure things like survival success, the number of eggs they lay on the different species of spruce. So final message, don't risk it. I think we're all aware of this. Importing plants really does pose a very serious risk of introducing serious pests. If you do have something, if you come across something and you're not sure what it is, we have a tree alert system. Really encourage you to send something in. You send in some photos and a report of what you found. If it's a dying tree, if you suspect pests or diseases on it, please, please, please use tree alert. It's through Forest Research. If you Google it, you can find it very easily. And that's it. Thank you for listening.
There you go. I made the mistake and not put my audio on. Thank you, Dagan. That was fascinating. So I appreciate that. Thank you. And there was a lot of detail in those slides. And I think with Dagan's permission, some of that detail could be shared post-event. I know the event is being broadcast live and also recorded. So obviously we can have that made available afterwards. We're just going to queue up our next presenter. Before we do that, this is a chance for anyone that's listened to that first presentation. If they have any questions, now's the time to ask them. We have had one in, Dagan, from Paul Webster. Thanks, Paul. He says, there doesn't appear to be any traps in the West Midlands. Is there any reason for this?
Actually, the sites that I trapped at, it was partly driven by having volunteers who were willing to empty traps over the course of a summer. So I initially targeted, because the work was being funded initially by the Forestry Commission, I targeted the big production forests, the areas where we had Forestry Commission staff. And then I moved on to, say, these high-risk areas. So it was really about where the big forests are. It's a snapshot study. It's absolutely a snapshot study. And I would love to fill in the gaps. But it did rely on having volunteers to empty those traps. So that's why, really, it was to try and cover as much space as possible. And it's a baseline study from which we can sort of build, I think. That's the idea.
Great. Thanks, Dagan. Hopefully, Paul, that answers your question on that one. Just going to get a few more minutes to get another question in. Yeah, Paul's put thanks. So I think I answered his question, Dagan. So thank you for that. We had a question in from Sam Shipman. So you, Dagan, mentioned wood chip imports is the rise of biomass. Let's just see if I can get the full question here, so it's cut some off. You mentioned wood chip imports is the rise of biomass going to see this being a problem in the future. So I think what he means is wood chip imports, the rise of biomass going to see this being a problem. So is this wood chip imports and the rise of biomass, is this going to be a problem in the future? I think he's what.
Yeah, so it's something actually that we've been very proactive about in the UK. So there were some real concerns over a couple of species in particular coming from North America. So emerald ash borer, which Sharon's going to mention, we're doing some work on it with the Canadians actually, because we think it's very, very serious. Was something I could have a whole talk on, and there's a related species called bronze birch borer. And what we found is that these wood chips that were coming over included both ash and birch in them from North America, which were coming for biofuel production. And some work that's been done in North America has demonstrated that actually chipping poor quality wood, infested wood, doesn't necessarily kill all of the larvae within them. and both emerald ash borer and bronze birch borer, if we got them, would be catastrophic, we think. Bronze birch borer essentially has been shown to be able to kill European birch with no resistance at all. And if we got it, we could potentially be looking at landscape without birch. So we've actually put, the UK have actually put restrictions on the import of both birch and ash wood chip from North America for just that reason. So yes, it's just yet another mechanism by which invasive wood and bark boring beetles can be moved. So it's something that a lot of countries are worried about.
Great, thanks, Dagan. Thank you, and thanks, Sam, for your question. I haven't had any more in now, Dagan, so I think that's it. You're off the hook for now. There might be some at the end of the presentation. So we're going to try and hand over now to our next presenter, which I think, there we go. Thanks, Sharon. She's just queuing up. So I'm going to disappear again, and it's over to you, Sharon.
I will try and do this with the webcam. I'll see how it works.
Yeah, we can see you. Great, thanks, Sharon. Thank you.
Right, good morning. Right, good morning. I'm Sharon Matthews-Berry. I work for DEFRA Plant Health Policy, and this morning I'm going to be talking about some of the recent plant health measures that have been introduced. I'll start by talking about the new national measures that have been introduced for emerald ash borer and Xylella fastidiosa, which have come into force today. And then I'll talk a bit about the recent changes to the EU requirements in relation to oak processionary moth. And then I'll just finish off with a couple of slides of other pests that we're considering for future regulation. So to start with the emerald ash borer. Now the emerald ash borer is a serious pest of ash which originated in Asia. It's an invasive pest in European, Russia and North America, and it has been listed within EU regulations for some time. And these requirements include specific requirements for import of ash trees, ash wood and associated products, which includes the wood chip, as Dagan was mentioning. In addition to ash, there's other hosts. There's the Japanese walnut, there's another species of walnut, there's this David's elm, there's a Japanese wingnut, and the white fringe trees, and these are all considered hosts and are all also regulated. Things to consider about emerald ash borer: it's a very strong flyer and can spread some distances, and obviously it's been introduced into Russia and there's been spread from Moscow, and it's estimated as being at about a rate of about 10 kilometers a year. And outbreaks of emerald ash borer have now been found within tens of kilometers of the Russian border with Ukraine and Belarus. There's also been findings of emerald ash borer in close proximity to the border with Kazakhstan and China. And recently, in October last year, there was the first report of emerald ash borer was confirmed in the Ukraine. Now, for the reasons of the spread of the of emerald ash borer, we've been looking at changes to UK requirements for imports of ash wood and plants for planting, but there's also been a proposal for within the EU to update the legislation, in particular to bring the Ukraine within scope of that legislation due to the outbreaks that occurred last year. But in the UK, we've decided that we'd like to go a step further with this, and we would like to introduce requirements in relation to Belarus and Kazakhstan as well. And these would be requirements would apply to ash wood, bark and plants. Now, I put plants in brackets there. The reason for that is there are EU regulations in place at the moment which cover high-risk plants, and ash is a high-risk plant and is therefore prohibited from all third countries currently, and it is prohibited pending an assessment of the risk associated with plants coming from that particular country. But at the moment, ash is prohibited. Additionally, we wanted to make some changes to the requirements for the removal of sapwood, and the reason for this is there was an EU audit to the USA and Canada which concluded that it's very difficult to verify that 2.5 centimetres of sapwood has been removed from the outside of the wood, which was one of the previous requirements. And so it was decided that for the USA and Canada, they would not be able to import wood which had this removal of the 2.5 centimeters of sapwood, and instead there was a systems approach introduced for the USA and Canada, and therefore we wanted to remove the option for the removal of the 2.5 centimeters of sapwood for all countries, because if it's proved unreliable in the USA and Canada, it's likely to be unreliable that other countries are unable to meet this requirement either. So what new measures have we introduced? Well, the first one concerns the countries of origin, which we would see these requirements applied to. So in addition to the previous requirements, which were for Canada, China, both Koreas, Japan, Russia, Taiwan, and the USA, we have added Belarus, Kazakhstan, and the Ukraine. So the requirements for wood were that the wood had to be either treated with ionizing radiation or come from a pest-free area. Now, the update we've made to this is the one written in red on the slides, and that is that pest-free area must not be within 100 kilometres of a known outbreak. Now, the reason for using 100 kilometres is because this was a conclusion from the EPO-PRA, which stated that around an outbreak, you need to have a 100 kilometre buffer zone to prevent infestation of that area. We've also updated the requirements for wood chips. Again, these can only come from a pest-free area, and again, that must not be within 100 kilometres of a known outbreak. And the same requirements apply to isolated bark and objects made of bark. And again, for plants, and the plants does extend a bit further than plants for planting here. Plants includes cut branches with and without foliage. So any parts of plants have to come from a pest-free area, and again, not be within 100 kilometres of a known outbreak of emerald ash borer. Right, moving on to Xylella. So Xylella fastidiosa is a pathogen with a very wide host range. It's regulated within the EU requirements. However, recently there's been some further research and further information has emerged about this pathogen. In particular, there was an EFSA risk assessment which concluded that it takes over 3.7 years for 95% of olives to develop symptoms of Xylella fastidiosa pulchra, which is the olive species in southern Italy. That suggests a very long latency period for this pathogen, much longer than was anticipated before that. And in addition to that, in September 2018, Xylella was confirmed in 3 symptomatic olive trees in Belgium, which had originated in Spain in May 2018. And based on these findings, the EFSA opinion and the olive trees from Spain that were found in Belgium infected, it was considered that we need to take into account this information in terms of the legislation, in particular this much longer latency period than we thought, and this clear evidence that Xylella is moving in trade with olive species. So moving on to the UK measures, these are the measures that have been introduced today. The first part of these is a prohibition on the highest risk hosts. So we have prohibited both coffee and Polygala motifolium. Both these species seem to have a very high risk of infection, and we also have evidence of it moving in trade with both of these species. The second part of the requirements is in relation to olives and almonds, and these can now only be imported into the UK if they meet very much enhanced phytosanitary requirements, which I'll talk about a bit later. And again, for 3 other species, lavender, Nerium oleander, and rosemary, again, these can only be imported into the UK if they can meet a set of enhanced phytosanitary requirements. So moving on to the requirements for lavender and rosemary and Nerium. Now these will now need to come from a place of production which is included in a list that has these will now need to come from a place of production which is registered with the MPPO in the country of origin, and that name of that place of production has been provided to the UK NPPO, to DEFRA. They also need to be grown on that place of production for at least 1 year prior to export to the UK. And that place of production, along with the surrounding 200 metres, needs to be surveyed and shown to be free from Xylella fastidiosa. Then the plants on the place of production need to have been inspected and tested using a sampling scheme that can reliably detect a 99% infection. It's 99% reliable detecting a 5% level of infection. They also need to be inspected as close as possible to movement before they leave the place of production. There also needs to be chemical and cultural controls to ensure that vectors are kept to a low level. And if they are grown in an area where Xylella is known to occur, they need to be grown under complete physical protection. In relation to these plants, the lavender, the rosemary and Nerium, there is a potential for them to be imported as unrooted cuttings. If that's the case, they need to have met all the above requirements. So they need to be on the registered place of production. There needs to be the area around the 200 metres surrounding to be free from, and there needs to be sampling and testing of those mother plants. Moving on to the olives and almonds, once again, these need to come from a place of production which is registered and supervised by the MPPO in the country of origin, and that place of production needs to be notified to the UK MPPO, to DEFRA, in advance. They also need to have been on that place of production for at least 1 year prior to export, and during that time, again, there needs to be the regular inspections of the place of production and its surrounding 200 metres to ensure that it's free from the presence of Xylella fastidiosa. And all olives and almonds at that place of production need to be sampled using a scheme which is capable of identifying with 99% reliability a presence of 5% infection. They again need to be inspected as close as possible to movement. And again, in areas where Xylella is known to occur, they must have been grown under complete physical protection. And in the case of olives and almonds, this would be 4 years under physical protection, or throughout their life for plants younger than 4 years. And this is because of the latency period that was identified in the work from EFSA. Another requirement that we would want to see in place here is that these trees are individually labelled with a tamper-proof seal or some kind of labelling that cannot be removed or tampered with, so that we have traceability of the place of production, so it can be related back to the list that we have of where we consider would be safe production sites for these plants to come from. So moving on to oak processionary moth. This is slightly different because this is not part of the UK national measures which have been introduced today. National measures were introduced last summer, and then there's been an update to EU requirements in line with those, which I'll come on to in a bit. Oak processionary moth was first found in London in 2006. It is established in the EU, and there is a containment area in the southeast around the London area. In the rest of the UK, it's under eradication. You'd probably say there was a bit of a change in the situation last summer when there were many interceptions of OPM on trees from Europe. And all the interceptions related to one specific option within the legislation, and that was the plants could come from a pest-free place of production, which was within a freedom of its immediate vicinity. And it was clear that this option had failed in this situation. So in order to close the gap initially, there was the introduction of UK emergency measures, and then later the EU requirements were updated to reflect those UK national measures, and that happened in December last year. So just to look at the sort of specific requirements now for importing oak trees, these need to have either come from a country which is known to be free from oak processionary moth, or have been grown throughout their life in an area which is known to be free, or to have been grown throughout their life under complete physical protection. And you can see from that there's no longer the option to import oak greater than 8 centimetres at 1.2 metres height from a pest-free place of production, because that option was clearly failing last summer. So, and it's good to see that's been removed from the EU measures, and it was good that happened with the update of those in December last year. And just to finish off, I thought I'd mention a couple of pests that are on our radar for future legislation, and actually both of them were mentioned by Dagan as well. The first one is the Agrilus bilineatus, the two-line chestnut borer. You notice this is another Agrilus species, like the emerald ash borer and the bronze birch borer, which is also mentioned by Dagan. This one is a pest of oak and chestnut. It's native to the USA and Canada, and it's been found to be particularly damaging to English oak in its native range. And actually, some anecdotal evidence from Michigan State University seems to suggest that the particularly susceptible trees on their campus were ones of provenance from Sherwood Forest. So it's a particular concern to us in the UK. There's been a few adults trapped in Turkey recently, and again, coming back to the comments about wood chips, the suspicion is these have arrived in this pest has arrived in Turkey via wood chips. It's not doing any damage in Turkey, but that might be because the conditions are not appropriate for it there. And the hosts are probably not grown as widely in Turkey as they would in more northern areas of Europe. There is an EPO-PRA which has now been finalised, and we're developing UK measures in relation to this pest. So that would be measures in relation to oak and chestnut. And another pest that was again mentioned by Dagan as well, it's Massicus raddei, the oak longhorn beetle, another pest of oak and chestnut, which is native to northeastern areas of China, but it's recently been found to be quite damaging on quercus species in China. And I think in one case, they're looking at over 80% of oak trees in a stand were infested. Again, there's an EPO-PRA, which has now been finalised on this one, and we're looking at developing UK national measures in relation to this pest. So I think that's where I'm going to finish now. So thank you very much for listening. And if there's any questions, I will hand back to Darren. Thank you.
That's great, thank you. I think I'm actually going to get Owen to do this one. So Owen, if you'd like to read some of the questions we've had.
Yep, will do. Thanks, Darren. Yep, so we've got a few questions for you, Sharon. First one from Andrew Fisher-Tomlin. Just bear with me. That's it. Asks regarding the movement of ash trees within the UK. Is he right in thinking that movement of ash trees within the UK have recently been allowed again?
Yes, that is the case, because the ash dieback can no longer really be justified as a quarantine pest within the UK because it is so widespread. So it is, while as long as we can't have it as a quarantine pest, we can't implement specific requirements on it. So it's now more a case of working with the industry to ensure that there isn't a severe damage. But obviously, there's always going to be a risk associated with oak trees because the ash dieback is so widespread in the environment now.
Yeah, thank you. Second question from Charles Bennett asking regarding emerald ash borer. How does emerald ash borer affect the import of firewood? Does it have to come from a pest-free area 100 kilometres from the nearest outbreak?
Yes, it does, because the requirements are wood is wood. It's regardless of whether it's firewood or timber, the same requirements would apply. So firewood would need to come from a pest-free area and 100 kilometres from the nearest outbreak.
Brilliant, thanks, Sharon. And the last question regarding oak processionary moth from Carol Edwards. Is there clarification on the permitted movement of Quercus ilex within the UK where oak processionary moth is already here, i.e. which zones can the trees be moved into or out of?
So the requirements apply to all Quercus species other than Quercus suber. So movement within the UK, the only bit that you can't be moving out of is the area which is excluded from our protected zone, which is the area surrounding London. So movement within the rest of the UK is not restricted, but movement out of the infested area is where the restrictions apply, and that would be the same requirements that apply to movement into the UK from other infested areas. Great. Because that area is excluded from our protected zone.
Thank you very much. And that's it, Sharon. That's all the questions now. So thanks once again, and I'll move the presentation over to Sandra. Here we go.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
Just while waiting for Sandra to load up her presentation, just a reminder, I think most people are using the questions, which is great. So please do feel free to use those. It might be you have questions that perhaps the panelists might not be able to answer today, but they can certainly go away and do the research for you and come back to you personally. So it's worth you definitely asking the question now while you've got the chance, because we'll make sure that that does get passed along. So I think we've just got our presentation coming up with Sandra now. So I'm going to mute myself. Sandra, over to you.
Right, okay. Thanks very much, Ern and Darren. I must say my heart rate is going way above normal here, just trying to load this presentation. So, you know, it's really quite a nerve-wracking experience for me, and I'd ask everybody to bear with me if I can't you know, move it through or communicate as clearly as I'd like to. So on that sort of beginning, I'd just like to thank you, both Darren and Owen, for inviting me to talk to you today. It feels a bit weird because I haven't had the opportunity before to address the BALI group, and to be beginning this in a webinar is quite surreal for me. Anyway, today I'm going to talk to you about the factors that stress oak trees, and I hope that you'll be able to leave this meeting with the knowledge and some confidence, really, to try some management solutions. And so, you know, I feel that together we should be able to ensure the resilience of our really precious oak trees. And this talk is geared really specifically at landscapers. So I'm thinking more of parklands, gardens, and in Forestry Commission sort of amenity areas rather than plantations and woodlands. And so the talk has been particularly tailored for that audience. So for those of you that don't know who I am or what I do, really, I'm a forest and plant pathologist with more than 30 years of experience in diagnosing and supplying solutions to plant and tree diseases. And for more than the last decade, I've focused solely on diseases of native oak trees in the UK, and specifically the very complex decline diseases of oak. At the moment, I lead a team of dedicated research scientists who've obviously built on the achievements of other forest pathologists before us, but this group of young researchers now actually lead globally on knowledge of acute oak decline. So today, because the topic is so wide, today I really wanted to focus on predisposition or stress factors. And as I say, I've tried to tailor the talk with specific relevance to producing resilient oak in a designed landscape. And so I feel that in order to start this talk, you really need to have a bit of an understanding. Whoops, and here I go wrong. I can't get the slide going down.
Yeah, don't worry, Sandra.
Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Yep.
You've got it. There you go. There you go. You've got it.
Okay, righto, thank you. So yes, I feel that it's important that I just sort of remind you about the difference between diseases and decline diseases. So there's a little bit of theory here. A disease is really defined as a continuous irritation which causes a deviation from normal functioning of the host. And in disease situations, it's often got detrimental, even fatal effects to the hosts. So this is as opposed to, for example, wounding, which is a one-off type of a damage to the host, but the host can usually recover from that damage. The disease is rather continuous. And you get several categories of disease. So you can get infectious diseases, which is probably what we all think of as a disease, and these have got biotic causes. Then you can also get non-infectious diseases, which generally have abiotic causes and can be related to something, you know, for example, like continuous salt damages or continuous fertilization effects or things like that. And then, of course, there's the category that we're becoming more and more aware of, and that is latent diseases. You've heard a little bit from Sharon today about Xylella, and the other one is where you've got an altered function of organisms that might not normally have been considered as pathogens, and these obviously are on the increase with changed climate and also, you know, with nursery environments where you get a lot of hybridization and the swap of genetic material, and so you're getting these evolving or emerging or changing organisms. So traditionally, there's been, and this still holds true for all models, to be honest, the very basis of it, we talk about the disease triangle. So in order for a disease to happen, you have to have a host, a susceptible host, you have to have a conducive environment, and you have to have the pathogen. And so this is a dynamic relationship, and it's called a one pathogen, one disease model. And key examples of that, you've heard quite a few this morning, but Phytophthora aurorum, you know, is a good example of that everybody would be aware of. Ash dieback, those are all key examples. But when we look at this model of primary diseases, in other words, one pathogen, one disease, we realize that there are a number of shortages in the model. And firstly, it doesn't take account of the temporal aspects of pathosystems. So how do things evolve over time? It's also very short on detail. It's obviously a very simplistic sort of model, which captures everything at a high level, which is good, but it's short on detail. And more importantly, it doesn't take account of some of the new emerging information about essential intermicrobial interactions. So people might have heard of things like microbiomes, and some of these intermicrobial interactions are actually fundamental to pathobiomes. And so we look at a slightly more involved model, which was actually developed in the 1980s, but all these sort of little green bits that are added on here have been bits that my work and my team's work are adding on to the model, and we hope to quite soon sort of evolve that to more approximate some of the and capture some of the model, the modern knowledge. And so I just want to sort of compare the definition of an ordinary disease against a decline disease. And in the bottom corner, the decline, the definition of decline diseases is written there. And you can see that declines arise from interactions of interchangeable, but specifically ordered, abiotic and biotic factors that overall produce a deterioration of the tree, and this often ends in the death of trees. And so the first thing that should strike you is that there's not one particular cause or one single cause that is implicated in this system and this situation. And so this model that was developed by Magnon in the 1980s has got three phases to it. And the first phase here is called the predisposition phase, and that goes round in this spiral. And you can see that this really captures largely the abiotic factors. So it's urban environment, soil compaction, poor soil fertility, low soil moisture, drainage, climate change, air pollution, all those sorts of things, but would also include things like the genetic potential of the host And the more we go on, we also realize that management history could be an important factor in this predisposition. So predisposition, these are factors which generally environmental factors that stress trees, they modify the plant resistance and make it more susceptible to disease taking place. And then in this model, Magnan suggested that you could get an inciting factor, which I've called a tipping point there, or tipping events. We're not altogether sure of this in, for example, acute oak decline, but it could be true in some other oak decline situations where you have a once-off event, or perhaps a similar event that happens 2 or so years in a row, which tips a tree from being resilient or tolerant of certain situations into becoming susceptible. And these type of situations would be severe defoliation events. You could have droughts, you could have excessive frosts, those kinds of things which could tip the trees. And then finally, you get the contributing factors, which is right at the inner level of the spiral. And these really are cumulative biotic effects which land up overwhelming the whole or parts of the host. So what's really important about this model is that it captures the element of time. It also points out that it's a dynamic system. But what our work is also sort of showing is that actually within each one of these little elements here, we almost have an entire spiral within a spiral. And our work is pointing out that scale could be quite an important factor when we're considering all these different, oh, that's gone the wrong way, sorry. Oh dear. That's it. When we trying to find out which factors are really important in oak declines. So then I just wanted to remind you of what oak declines are. Oak declines have been around for a long time. For earliest records on the continent go back to in the 1700s, but we've been more aware of them here in the UK since the early 1900s. And I think traditionally people have seen chronic oak decline, which is indicated in the lower panel, as really being what oak decline is. But you can see that some of the symptoms of oak declines are really very general, and this led to a bit of muddying the waters in trying to understand what the concept of oak decline is. And so over the years, even in Europe and so on, particularly in countries like Romania, and that people have tried to tease out the different elements and different types of oak decline. And my team has really led the world in getting them to accept that there are these different forms. And acute oak decline has really sort of established itself as a particular condition within the wider oak decline concept. And acute oak decline is characterized by these quite typical sort of stem weeps that you'll see on the trees. The arrangement of them is sort of quite spotty. They tend to be vertical, and the weeps can be either very small, just almost little dots, or they can be quite severe. And those weeps emanate out of a crack in the inner bark, and quite often you would see the D-shaped exit hole of the insect, and that is Agrilus bilineatus, and you've heard a little bit about that. If you had to open a bark panel around one of those weeping patches, in the very, very earliest phase of it, you would probably see these galleries of the very early instars of the beetle, and you may be lucky enough to see the sort of creamy bacterial sludge that's starting to develop on the trees. In a later stage, that has formed necrosis, and you can see the galleries of zigzagging around the place. The beetle has moved off quite a long time ago. The larva of the beetle has moved off quite a long time ago. And here is a fresh outbreak area, lesion, of the bacterial activity as it is degrading and rotting and breaking down this wood. So there are two real things going on here. There are these necrotic patches, as you can see, they're quite slimy, and these are the real damaging ones that are caused by the bacteria, and they're actually rotting and degrading the live bark tissues of the tree. And the second signs that you can see here, so these are symptoms because these are things that the pathogen is doing and the tree is responding, and these are signs that you can see the beetle is giving off. This is the beetle larval galleries. And in this particular point here, you can see that those galleries are becoming a little bit fuzzy, and that's where the larva is probably dragged some of the bacteria, and the bacteria has taken hold and starting a new little rotting patch going on over there. So these are typical symptoms of acute oak decline. Whereas chronic oak decline, I've put here that the concept is developing. It's very much in that phase. My team has really worked for the last 10 years quite hard on acute oak decline, and we're only just starting to really work on chronic oak decline. But chronic oak decline would be what people thought about more typically. You can see the thinning in the crown, you can see the dieback of the branches, you've got a lot of shedding of fine twigs going on, and in some instances you can get stem bleeding. This one in particular is a case where we've got an armillaria outbreak going on here, which is causing these chronic symptoms. And if you notice here, the bleeds are coming from each and every one of those points, those cracks between the bark plates, and you're seeing the half side of an A-frame shape here, which is quite characteristic of armillaria. And we think that chronic oak decline would be driven by poor root health, both feeder root and buttress root health. And in this particular picture here, you can see damage being done by Gymnopus fusipes. In old currency, this was Colibia fusipes, and the crowns of these trees can still be in really good condition. It takes decades for the rot to set in, but when the crowns start going, invariably that signals that the tree's probably not going to recover. So just to share then a conceptual model of the relationship between these two diseases, bearing in mind that I have said to you that the whole concept of chronic oak decline is still developing, but because it's attacking both parts, above and below ground parts, there obviously could be a relationship between the two. But focusing on acute oak decline for the moment, if we consider that it largely attacks above ground plants and leads to a rapid rate of decline, what we also find is that the trees are able to sort of recover and go into what we would call remission. We're not sure whether it's complete recovery and could go to become, healthy again, or whether we would get repeated outbreaks and new reinfections with an ultimate track to death. But there is quite a lot more hope about acute oak decline, and our monitoring of trees has shown that as many as 40% of our monitored trees do in fact display this kind of recovery. Now, focusing on chronic oak decline, where we feel that the below ground ill health is a driver of this disease, it's really important to note that this is a very slow, has a very slow rate of decline. You can get spread within the tree, so it can go from root to root. And, I think that this is really a one way for the tree, and it doesn't really recover. So it goes down towards death. But we could also have a situation where a tree started out with AOD and then became susceptible to some of the COD things, and similarly the reverse could be true. But we do feel that if both conditions exist on a tree at the same time, we're going to go to a very rapid rate of decline and ultimate death. So I tried to just summarize some of the background work here. This is 10 years of research that you're seeing on one slide. So I hope you won't be overwhelmed with it, but I'm just going to quickly run through it. With acute oak decline, we recognized that it was a discrete disease within the oak decline complex. Bacteria were key in causing the actual necrosis and the rotting of the live bark tissues. And all the bacteria we found were new to science. We had to describe new species. We had 2 new genera and so far 15 new species. We then found which ones were consistently occurring and seemed to be key damaging agents. We managed to get them in pure culture and unravel the entire genomes of those trees. We then found there were pathogenic genes within those trees. We compared whether those genes were active in healthy versus diseased trees, and we didn't find those differences. And when we set up trials in woodlands as well as in the laboratory, we found that the genes were active and we could close the loop more or less, as it were, proving their pathogenicity. It was a long, hard road, and we still got one or two final steps that we have to do there, but I think we're more or less there with it. Then we also, Nathan Brown and his team, well, Nathan Brown really and TSU did a nationwide, or England and Wales wide, because the climatic conditions in Scotland are not suitable for AOD, and that relates to the beetle. We'll come to that in a moment. But Nathan did a survey, a structured survey across the country, but we also used all of the records that our citizen science report to us. And so we were able to find out where the trees, where the AOD infections were, and that was important for the next phase of our work. But what was also a key part to this, because I've just explained about it, there is this interaction between the bacteria and the beetle, and it was a key involvement of entomologists, so Dagan and his team, and in particular his PhD student, Katie Reed, and they managed to rear this beetle, Agrilus bigotatus, in captivity. This was done for the first time in the world, and Katie, for the first time across Agrilus species, the wider 3,000 species, Katie was the first to rear it through its entire life cycle, from mating, egg laying, baby larvae, through to pupation and emergence. So that was really a huge thing. But what was very important was they were able to supply us with these beetle eggs and baby larvae, which we were able to use in the trials where we put the bacteria as well as the beetle. And so that was all very pioneering work and very rewarding to do, but quite challenging. So really the approach that we've taken to understanding this problem has been an interdisciplinary approach, where we've incorporated modern omic things as well as some traditional areas. Taxonomy was important. We're still busy with this whole area looking at the genetics and metabolomics and dendrochronology. And today I'm going to be focusing an awful lot on the, not only on the spatial epidemiology and modeling, but the environmental factors that drive that. Also, we've got a project, we've just been very lucky to win a BBSRC grant, where we're going to look at some of the human aspects of it, particularly human attitudes and attitudes to land use and to management, and this stakeholder engagement, and I'll come back to that. So we're hoping to arm everybody with more information on management. So today's talk really is going to focus quite a lot on this outer circle, and the basis for that, the driving sort of thought behind that, was that trees really need their water and nutrients to grow, and that predisposition factors could impede or limit this ability to pick up water and nutrients. It could cause deficiencies in the trees or imbalances, and the trees would respond to these deficiencies and imbalances. They would become stressed, and then they become more susceptible to the risk of pest and disease attack. And so we were granted a project by DEFRA called the FPPH project on oak resilience. It was part of future-proofing our trees. And we had 4 work packages, which all related to the question, are there identified predispositional drivers in oak declines in the UK? And we had the 4 work packages where we looked at the biochemistry. We also looked at the rhizosphere in terms of the biotic components there using modern techniques. We looked at rhizosphere nitrogen cycling, which is really important, especially over the long term for tree acquisition of nitrogen, which is a hugely important macro element. And then we also had a look at the essential pathogens that were there, thinking about what kind of a role these could have on feeder roots and nutrient uptake. Now, as you can imagine, I'm busy with the report now, and we're on about 160 pages of the report. And so what I'm going to do is only report to you a little bit of this work package 1, which was led by Elena Vangulova. So quite honestly, I'm only the messenger here today, but Elena and her team have done most of this work. So in order to answer this, we had the question about, are there identified predispositional factors? We had we had a number of hypotheses. We thought that there would be. We thought that these factors would vary at different scales. So we had national site and tree scales, and also according to tree condition, and that anything that altered and impaired tree nutrient uptake would be linked with the soil conditions and poor root development, really. And so we began this work with a desktop study where we consulted all of the national data sets that are available at the Met offices and CEH and Cranfield University, where we could get hold of all these factors and try and test them for correlations using the information that Nathan had about the survey information and all the citizen science reports that had been added to it to give us a distribution. And we did indeed come up with some correlations that occurred at the national scale. This work has already been published and is available out there, but if people would like a copy of the publication, they can just contact us and we will send it off to them. So the correlations that we found was that AOD tended to occur in warmer areas where there was low rainfall and low elevation, and the low elevation probably also corresponds with the warmer areas. And all of these warmer and low rainfall areas would also play into the beetle's preferences and life cycle needs. We also found that AOD occurred over high nitrogen depositional areas and low sulfur depositional environments and on drought-sensitive soils. So to give you slightly more detail of that, we've got the day degrees at 11.5 degrees Celsius, which is the critical lowermost threshold for the beetle to survive. And the black dots show where AOD is, whereas the crosses show where it's not. And you could definitely see that it's in the warmer areas there. Similarly so with the rainfall, it's in the drier areas, not in the wetter areas. And it also tends to be across the high nitrogen depositional areas. And so that enabled us to model it and to come up with a predispositional probability area map, and this is available, but we still need to do a bit further development on it, but it is available. So then we went down to looking at it at a site-specific scale, and to do that we had 10 study sites, including AOD and COD trees. We had 10 healthy and 10 symptomatic trees on each site, and we sampled soils and roots and foliage around all of those trees, and then sent them to our labs for analyses. We looked at morphological and chemical aspects of foliage, roots, and soils. And there were just so many parameters that we measured. The data sets are eye-watering, but you can see that we've had morphological features as well as all of these chemical features that we've taken account of. And we're just busy analyzing that data now, but we can see some patterns that are indeed occurring. So just to show you that at the site level, we can see some of those things. So speculation and chestnuts were two areas where COD was very prevalent. You can notice over here that the rainfall is much higher than the other sites where AOD was very prevalent. And you can also notice that they've got much cooler days by having fewer growing days above 11.5, where the other areas are high. Now, all of the sites tended to be at above the threshold level of nitrogen, which is 12. I think actually somehow this hasn't come through on this particular slide, but the threshold level for nitrogen is 12 kilograms per hectare per A, whatever that might be. And in all of our forests, the levels are very much higher, but in some of them they were, you know, like coming up to more than double, 3 times the amount. And some recent information has also suggested to us that there's a gradient of nitrogen deposition from the margin edges where the depositional areas are very high, decreasing a bit to the central areas of the margins of the forests. And so, you know, what this is just showing is that what we found at the national scale, those trends are being seen at the site level too. But what I wanted to focus on in the last 5 minutes here was that we found a particular scenario that is acidity driven and that applies to AOD sites. And so this plays to the high, dry and wet nitrogen deposition that we're getting on the canopy and the foliage of the trees. We get rainfall and those nitrogen forms are converted in through fall, giving rise to soil acidity. When we get a rise in soil acidity, it has knock-on effects on some important chemicals in the soil, and we're finding that there's an increase or there's a release of aluminium ions in the soil, and this is leading to high levels of aluminium and in fact even aluminium toxicity. In these more soil acidic environments, some essential elements such as calcium, magnesium and potassium are being locked, and so they're not becoming available for plant uptake. And so this is also then causing difficulty for the trees in picking up these essential elements. But also as a result of the aluminium toxicity here, what we're finding is that it's impacting the fine roots on the trees. And the fine roots are those roots that are responsible for picking up all of these elements. So we're finding that in AOD trees, we've got lower biomass of fine roots. We've got far fewer root tips, which would also mean far fewer ectomycorrhizal fungi. And the ectomycorrhizal fungi that are there are not as helpful to the trees as they could be. We've also got a lot less branching going on in the roots. And so this is really causing a bottleneck here, preventing the roots and therefore the leaves to pick up these essential elements. And so we're getting this whole overall declined condition of the tree. And we found evidence of that at all 4 of our AOD sites. And so we've managed to develop this first model where we need to do a little bit more work on it. But essentially, it comes down to, you know, at the smaller scales that we've got the soil nutrient and the physical characteristics as predispositional drivers. I forgot to point out about the very high stone levels that we found on some sites in the soil. We also know that AOD will appear on sort of droughty soils. And so now we're starting to see that this high soil acidity, giving off high levels of ammonium, but low levels of plant available nitrogen, phosphorus and calcium are having an impact, poor tree feeder root development, and so again, reduced impact on the trees, and the calcium uptake and nitrogen and carbon cycling has also been implicated and affected. So the question is, how does all of this help you as landscapers? Well, I think that the key take-home message here is avoid tree stress. We're just pointing out things in the environment and the soil types and how these can affect the tree health, and compaction will be an important part of that, and obviously the season that you plant the trees. So consider the tree health. If you consider root-bored trees, these have already had half of their major roots chopped off, and oak trees are tap-rooted tree systems. You're already chopping those roots off and putting these trees under huge stress. The age of the trees, you're putting in quite large trees and asking them, you know, to deliver for you. We've already, and Dagan and Sharon have touched on the origin of these trees and the risks of imported problems that come along with it. And so what kind of advice can we offer you at this stage to try and help improve your success rate? Organic matter is very important, but the type of organic matter is even more important. Try for it to be as natural as possible, natural litter, so oak leaves that are composting. So all the street sweepings that go on in the area, use those, let those mold away and use those as your natural organic material. Avoid no deep mulching, and there's new information on the horizon that the mulch preparation is very important, so watch this space. There will be some new information coming out very soon. On your recent transplants, water them on planting, and water them throughout the first or second seasons as required. Help them along. Compaction, avoid unnecessary footfall traffic, stock on the sites, vehicles, and maintain this manually over time, very gently, by using long pronged forks. Treat it gently, avoid terraventing where it's very dramatic, and I think particularly on old trees it's like a real shock. You know, old people like me need a long time, need to do things gently. The trees need the same kind of treatment. You can use fencing to help trap that litter when you've got leaf fall, to prevent compaction and wounding. And here's your real power, landscapers. Mindsets. It's up to you. Set new fashions, set new norms, set new expectations. Landscapers can lead and feed public perceptions of beauty. It's up to you to think about thinking in terms of tree lifespans, finite spaces, how to reshape these the space and be dynamic in urban forests. So in conclusion, I want to say that we've definitely shown that there are some predisposition factors that can be identified. Further testing will obviously provide empirical evidence that will lead to management options. Feeder root health is all important. More research is necessary. And landscapers have a huge role in helping to restore environmental balances in a sustainable and life-supporting way. Use this opportunity. Research is here to help, and I believe that together we can make a difference. You can say it with design, say it with plants, and say it for a better world. And if you want some more information about our research, we've just released 2 films. There's one on the YouTube on this link, or there's one through the Vimeo link, and there's the original film on YouTube about how we've carried out this research. And if you want any more information, we've just had a report back meeting where we've presented that work and shared it with stakeholders. You're very welcome to have that. Please feel free to contact either myself or Sally Simpson at the same address, and we will very gladly send it on. And so on that note, I'll leave it there, and thank you all for listening.
Sandra, thank you very much. That was incredibly detailed, and I think I'm right in saying one of your first webinars. I'm not sure if that's true,
It's
but if
the
it was,
first one.
then that was really very, very good. So thank you so much. And I think we've been keeping an eye on the audience figures here, and I don't think anybody lost interest during that, just so you know. So you managed to hold the audience for the entire time. So I think a big well done is in order. We've had a comment come in from Nikki. Nikki Jackson says, absolutely fascinating, mind-blowing, complicated, but inspirational.
Thank you.
So I just thought I'd pass that on to you. So well done, and well done to the other two speakers so far. Apologies to the audience, we are running over slightly, but I think we're not seeing a decrease in attendees. So I'm assuming that people are interested and are happy to continue. We have one more speaker for you, and we do have a question come in from Carol Edwards, actually for Sharon. But Sharon, we're going to leave that till the end, if that's okay. We're going to get straight on to Matt. So I'm just going to try and get Matt on now, and we will continue. Apologies, we're running a little bit late, as I say, but with this next presentation, I think it will be a really important one. Okay, so we're just waiting for Matt to fire that up. So while he does that, again, as before, anyone that's perhaps joined us halfway through or doesn't know how this works, please send in your questions during this presentation, this final presentation. We're going to aim to try and finish obviously before midday. We're aware it's 11:33 now, but obviously Matt's presentation is, as I say, they've all been important, but this one in particular have a lot of people interested in the plant passport system. So Matt, over to you.
I hope you can all hear me clearly and hopefully see the slides in front. I'm Matthew Casey, and like Sharon, I'm from the Plant Health Policy team. And today I'll be talking through the new plant passporting regime, which comes out of the plant health regulations, which came into force on 14th of December of last year. So just a quick run through of what I'll go through. I'll give an introduction on plant passports, what they are, and their purpose, the widened scope under the new regulations, or authorization to issue plant passports under the new regulations, what a plant passport looks like and what to attach it to, our policies around auctions and shows. Also, I haven't got this on this contents page, but I will also be running through a couple of scenarios quite briefly, and just sort of a reiteration of our approach to non-compliance under the current circumstances regarding plant passports, and then just pointing to some other resources. So an overview of plant passports under SRSF. So SRSF is Smarter Rules for Safer Food. That's a big package of regulations, including plant health and animal health regulations. And so we use SRSF as a short term for that. So the scope of plant passporting under SRSF has been widened to include all plants for planting, as well as some other plant products. There is a new clearer format to the plant passport to ensure better consistency and recognisability across the EU. And the scope within the supply chain has changed, so it's not just the scope of the commodities. Plant passports are now required down to retail level, and in some instances to final users buying for personal use. And the system of authorization to issue plant passports and the requirements around record keeping, as well as the labels themselves, should improve both assurance and traceability throughout the supply chain. And that's something I really want to emphasize. I know there was a lot of talk, certainly in the run-up to December last year, of plant passports just being a traceability document. But it's very important that people understand that this is also about plant health assurance, not just traceability. And I'll come on to that in more detail later in the presentation. So the widened scope of plant passporting. First of all, what is the purpose of the widened scope? A question I've been asked a lot is why does it not target high-risk plants? Why is it so wide? Because it includes now all plants for planting. And the short answer is it's about taking a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach. So this is going to allow us to tackle pest threats as they emerge, rather than waiting for a pest to come up, then regulating it and working backwards. The requirement for plant passports down to retail level and the capturing of distant sales means pretty much all traders of plants must now be known to the competent authority, and will have plant health obligations, whether they're a nursery, a landscaper, a high street retailer, or if they're selling solely online. And of course, trade nowadays can lead to the spread of damaging pests, processionary moth, which has already been mentioned today, and Xylella fastidiosa. And so plant passports is another weapon in our arsenal, if you like, to controlling the spread of these pests throughout trade. So what commodities will require a plant passport? So under the new regulations, this includes plants for planting other than seeds. So plants for planting means plants intended to remain planted, to be planted, or to be replanted. This does also include turf. Some other plant products also require a plant passport. So a full list is available on gov.uk, but it does include some fruits with peduncles, wood of trees like plane, and some seeds, including seeds of both sunflower and rice, which are pictured there. And any plants are planting, so that can include things like potted orchids, potted pansies, anything like that. The list for the UK, of course, we have protected zone status for pests which are present in other parts of the EU, but not in the UK. This does include a lot of timber products, so wood of sweet chestnut, genus Castanea, wood of conifers, we have protected status for. There are also PZ zones for certain pests, which are pests of things like snowy mesphalus, hibiscus, many palm species, and also seed potatoes. And again, a full list is available on gov.uk. Movements are now covered by the plant passport regime. So if we can consider the widened scope to have two parts to it. So there's the widened scope of commodities, which I've just gone through, and there's a widened scope of movements within supply chains. So this includes distance sales, which is things like online and mail order sales. Timber movements within Great Britain now require plant passports, and passports are now required all the way down to retail level. So must be at least provided down to individual retail stores and garden centres. So registration as a professional operator. So registration is distinct from becoming authorised to issue plant passports. You can consider it the first of a two-step process. So you must be registered before you can be authorised. Registration is free. It involves filling out a form which outlines some important information, which includes, but I should say it's not limited to, a statement concerning your intention to carry out activities such as issuing plant passports, or placing a mark on wood packaging material which attests that that wood packaging material is ISPM compliant, address of your premises and the location of land plots used by you, and the sort of commodities that you trade in. And those details must be updated annually. Someone who is registered should be able to identify who supplied passported units they receive and record such details for 3 years. So even if you're registered, and say you are registered but you're not authorised to issue plant passports, you must still have plant passports supplied to you. So your obligations as a registered operator are pretty much record keeping and keeping your details updated to the competent authority on an annual basis. Authorization to issue plant passports. So if we consider this sort of a second step up, so you've become registered, then you become authorized to issue plant passports. Now, becoming authorized to issue plant passports does have record keeping obligations and the obligations, of course, to update your details to the competent authority, because you must be registered, so you have those obligations. But you have things on top of that. Becoming authorized to issue plant passports is essentially showing that you meet a minimum standard of plant health. Now, you won't be charged for becoming authorized online. APHA do charge a fee for paper forms posted to them. They charge a processing fee for that. The charge for becoming authorized to issue plant passports is the auditing check that is carried out on you to check your premises and the pest risk, and also check your record keeping. And you'll be charged for those inspections, which will be held later in the year. So the new requirements set out in the plant health regulation include the operator that's becoming authorized should have knowledge of pest biology and best practice in pest prevention and in eradication planning. Operators must have systems and procedures in place to fulfill obligations regarding the traceability of consignments. So really that's showing that you know about the pests of the plants that you trade in, you know what to do in the event of an outbreak, you know what records you're keeping, and the records you're keeping are appropriate and thorough. So we're already authorising operators to issue plant passports, of course, and I know APH are working hard and that they've developed an audit framework to ensure that operators are audited consistently later in the year. We did roll over authorisations of existing operators on 14th of December for those that were authorised ahead of the new regulations. For retailers, I suppose this is less relevant to those on the call, but retailers would need to be authorised if they wish to issue plant passports themselves. And cooperatives, if they're legally recognised entities, can be subject to a single authorisation. So what does becoming authorised actually mean in practice? So as I've said, anyone dealing professionally in plants should be registered, but it's only those issuing plant passports that need to be authorised to do so. And you'll be audited to ensure that you have those systems in place and that you're competent to issue the plant passports. So before issuing the plant passport, essentially attaching it to the commodities in question, you need to examine your plants beforehand. So it's about showing that you are competent to recognise the pests of the plants you trade in. So when you're issuing that plant passport, you're saying, I'm authorised to do this, I meet a minimum standard of plant health, and I'm assuring you that this plant is a healthy plant. And that's where that assurance comes from. So the record keeping, which I'll go on to in a minute, is about the traceability, but this authorisation and auditing process is where that assurance comes from. And it's about everyone in the trade having plant health obligations. So record keeping. So if you've issued a plant passport, you need to know if you've received that consignment from someone else, you need to know who supplied you with it. You also need to know the information within that plant passport, and you need to be able to record who you supplied the plant passport to. If you've only received a plant passport, so for example, if you're a registered operator, but you're not authorised to issue plant passports, but you're still receiving them, you need to be able to identify who has supplied you with each of those passports. And if you're supplying a plant passport, you must record who you've supplied that plant passport to. So that way we go to someone who's the final step in the supply chain. Let's say it's a gardener who only supplies domestic home gardeners. So they're registered, they're supplied with plant passports by the person who supplies them. They don't need to supply plant passports themselves because they only supply home gardeners. But they will have a record of the plant passports they've received. So we can say if there's an issue, okay, this is a gardener that supplied you, you have a record of that plant passport, okay, who supplied you with that, and then work our way up the supply chain. So the content and format of the new plant passport. So this is a brief outline of it. So we have the botanical name, that should be genus and species. And then part B is the country code of the issuer. So that's GB in our case. Now GB includes Northern Ireland for the UK. And then dash and then your registration number. C is traceability code and D is country of origin. So you should have the EU flag, which may be printed in colour or in black and white in the top left. Then the words plant passport in English, if relevant in one other official language of the Union. So I suppose if you're exporting to another member state, they may want you to put plant passport / and then say it could be in French and German. I have seen French and German plant passports. And then the botanical name concerned. And then I should say, so part B, as I've said, is the 2-letter code of the member state in which you're registered, and then your national registration number. And then part C is a traceability code. So plants which are prepared and ready for sale to a final user, so essentially the plant isn't undergoing any more preparation before it gets down to its, say, a domestic gardener, that does not require a traceability code. If a plant is going to be grown on, if it's going to be repotted, if it's going to be mixed in a pot with other plants, all of those things may change the phytosanitary risk status of that plant. And so before it gets to that stage, it requires a traceability code. But once it's in its final state, ready for sale to a final user, a traceability code is no longer used. So some plants do require traceability codes in all cases, but at the moment, the Commission is working on that list. We'll notify stakeholders when we have sight of that, but that hasn't been finalised by the European Commission yet. And the 2-letter code of the member state of the country of origin, that can also be a third country of origin. Information on when country of origin actually can be changed to GB can be found on gov.uk. I won't go through it here now, but essentially it surrounds whether or not a plant has been grown on or not. So once a plant has been grown on here for a certain amount of time in certain conditions, you can change the country of origin, for example, from NL to GB. Other information that can be on a plant passport, so it can include a unique barcode, QR code or similar, but that's optional. Plant passports must be legible, but they can be handwritten as long as that's in capitals, and the information cannot be modified. I should also say the plant passport must be distinct and separate from other information associated with the consignment. So if I go back up here, you can see that it's on a care label, but it's clearly in its own distinct box. So plant passports are protected zones. So for plants for which we have protected zone status, it's very similar, but it'll have plant passport PZ on it. And then below that is the PZ code. And for that, you either have the scientific name of the pest, for example, for oak processionary moth, that would be a Vomatopoeia processionarea, or it can be the EPO code specifically attributed to that pest. And a list of these is available on gov.uk, and the links will be shared at the end. But essentially, in order to issue a protected zone plant passport, you need to show that you're competent to recognise these pests and that it must have met certain special requirements in order to have this issued. So essentially, it's a protected zone plant passport. It's basically saying, I've issued this, and there is definitely no trace of this particular pest on this consignment, and it is safe to travel within this protected zone. It's a statement of that. So for products which require a certification label, so if you don't currently work with these, I think this mostly applies to certain seed species, but essentially the words plant passport and the flag go above it, and all the information you would currently have in a certification label would go below that. The certification label itself hasn't changed because that's governed by separate legislation. And a list of products which require one of these combined plant passports is available on a plant health portal, but I don't think would be of much concern to most of the people on this call. So attachment of plant passports. So in most cases, plant passports won't need to be attached to each individual plant. If you're selling the same commodity on pallets trays, the plant passport must be attached to each of those individual units. If there are multiple commodities though on the same pallet or tray, that passport must then be attached to the individual units. So for example, if you have a tray of plants and there's many different species, you are then going to have to passport each pot within that tray. Now, this one is probably most concerned to those on the call. So this is about whether or not you're at the final stage of the supply chain. So what we've said is that if you're directly supplying retail, for example, a garden centre, a single plant passport could cover a single trolley of plants, as long as traceability can be maintained for the plants on that trolley. Trolleys moving at other stages in the supply chain could only be covered by a single plant passport if the plants on that trolley were of the same species. I should say that you're only allowed a single plant passport going directly to retail, covering a mix of plants in a trolley if that trolley is going directly from the supplier direct to a single store and it's not being modified, so plants aren't being removed or put on during that journey. And similarly, if commodities are moved in a van from a contractor's yard to a site, if that site is the final destination, it's the final stage in the supply chain, and it's not being, the plants in that van aren't being modified, then they can be, a single plant passport can travel with that van as that movement is the final one in the supply chain. If you are selling through distance contracts, for example, online, and you're supplying final users, you still have to supply that final user with a plant passport. This is about capturing online sellers and ensuring they make sure that they reach the same plant health standard as everyone else in the trade. The plant passport in such cases can be attached to the box. It can be on the plant pot or material in question, or it could travel on the delivery advice note if that delivery advice note is traveling within the package. So auctions and shows. I'm not sure how many of you buy from auctions, but as you are professional operators and buying from auctions, you'll need to be supplied with plant passports if you're buying through that auction. Only if someone is supplying an auction and they're selling to final users do they not need to supply the final users with a plant passport. So if units are marked retail sale only, not for resale, then that can only be bought by a home gardener. An operator supplying that material to the auction wouldn't need to passport that material to them. They only then need to passport to the auction, which is acting as a retail outlet. However, if they're supplying a landscaper who's a professional operator through that auction, then they need to provide plant passports. And for shows, so essentially, excuse me, a professional operator supplying an exhibitor would need to issue a plant passport, but the exhibitor would not be required to provide a plant passport for the movement to the event because they already have a passport for the material that they've received, and they're just going to the event, showing it and bringing it back. If your material is delivered direct to event by your supplier, then that movement would require a plant passport. And furthermore, if you are selling at any show or event, if you're supplying final users face-to-face at that show, you don't need to passport them. But if you are selling to another professional operator at the show, you will be expected to passport that movement, as you would if you were selling to professional operators in any other circumstance, because shows then can't function as a loophole. And thank you for sticking with me. I realise this is a lot of information in quite a short amount of time. I'll just run through some quick scenarios that I hope will make it all a bit make sense a bit more. So if you're a landscape contractor supplying a commercial client, whether or not you need to provide plant passports depends. So if the landscape contractor, you're doing everything for the client, they've essentially sort of delegated everything to you, from the movement of the plants to their planting, you wouldn't need to provide plant passports to them because they're not professionally dealing with plants and they don't need to be registered. If your client is doing some of these activities themselves, then they are professionally dealing with plants, they do need to be registered, and then you would need to be authorized to supply plant passports to them. So in scenario 1, the client doesn't need registering. You as a landscape contractor would need registering, but you would need plant passports supplied to you. But then because you don't need to supply plant passports to that operator, you don't need to be authorized to supply your own plant passports. However, if it's scenario 2 and the client does need to be registered, you need to be authorized to issue plant passports to supply to them. So an authorized operator needs to know who supplied them with the plant passports, record any plant passports they issued themselves, and who they supplied those plant passports to. The registered operator, for example, the commercial client, would have record keeping obligations and should be able to identify for each passported unit or consignment they receive, so for example, a van load, who supplied them with that. Information can be stored physically or digitally, but it does need to be stored for a minimum of 3 years. And that's the same for any passport records. It's always minimum of 3 years. I should say that passports need to be physically attached or to physically accompany the consignments, but it is acceptable for record keeping purposes for you to email plant passport records. However, there is no legal obligation to do that, so that would have to be an agreement between you and your clients or suppliers. And as I stated earlier, a single plant passport can cover each van load of material, as long as traceability is maintained for that, as long as that load is being moved only once and it's not being moved on again. So it's sort of the buck stops there essentially. It's only if you can only have a single plant passport covering a mixed van load of material, if that's the final stage of the supply chain. And if you're a landscape contractor and you're only supplying domestic clients, so home gardeners, they don't need to be registered at all. So you would just need to be registered. You need to be supplied with plant passports and record those, but you don't need to supply any plant passports yourselves. And going forward, we obviously we know that there's been many challenges for industry recently, and actually last November, December time, we did agree a pragmatic approach to non-compliance with Lord Gardner, who is our Minister for Biosecurity, given a situation around EU exit and the timing of the new regulations coming on 14th of December. And now with renewed challenges for the industry because of COVID-19, we are acknowledging the challenges the industry are facing, and we're working to ensure our policies are pragmatic whilst maintaining high levels of biosecurity. We will deal with non-compliance fairly and proportionately in line with the DEFRA enforcement policy. And in most cases, this will start with businesses or individuals being given notice of non-compliances and giving advice on corrective action and a time period in which these actions can be completed. So this is us wanting to educate you and aiding you in becoming compliant with the new regulations, which of course is in all our interests regarding biosecurity. And I'll make sure that there's these are available afterwards, but these are links to all our online guidance. So we're looking at smart rules for safer food, plant health regulations on gov.uk, our guidance on issuing plant passports on gov.uk, and that includes the pages where there's the list of plants which require a plant passport versus those which require a protected zone plant passport. And I would really recommend taking a look at our plant health portal. There's a whole page devoted to SRSF and loads of resources that are on plant passports, including flowcharts that explain when you need to be registered versus when you need to be authorised. We have fact sheets there, an introductory guide to plant passports, and a very long question and answer guide as well. And I should say that on other parts of the plant health portal, there's loads of guidance around pests, such as some of those that my colleagues have previously mentioned during this webinar. So would really recommend that as a resource. So thank you very much, and I'll finish there just before midday.
That's great. Thank you very much, Matthew. If I may, could I just ask a few questions from the audience?
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, the first one from Carol Edwards asks, as a designer, if they order plants that are always delivered direct to the planting site, because, for example, the designer has nowhere to hold the plants, does the designer still need to register?
I would say that I think that they probably would be, because they are professionally dealing with plants, and they are, I assume then that because they're the ones ordering it, they could be considered responsible for the planting, and they're running a business off that. The person delivering the plants would be the one who'd have to do all the passporting, but I think a designer would have to be registered.
Brilliant, thank you. The second question I have from Rebecca Gosling asks whether the plant passporting system applies to plants from a small nursery selling directly to customers at markets. I assume these are domestic customers at markets as opposed to commercial ones.
They are, so they will need to be registered as they are moving regulated material. However, as they are supplying exclusively face-to-face to people at markets, they don't need to be authorised to issue plant passports for those movements, and they don't need to supply plant passports to their clients. If they were selling online, they would need to be authorised to issue plant passports for that, and they should be supplied with plant passports because they're registered. But by the sounds of it, they wouldn't need to be authorised, just registered.
That's great. Thank you very much, Matthew. I've actually got some questions, if I just scroll up from earlier on, regarding importation of quercus. Matthew, are you okay to answer those, or should I forward those to Sharon?
It depends. Is it just standard import of them, and whether or not they require a plant passport or a phyto, or does it regard national measures?
Yeah, I'll raise them now. Regarding restrictions to import quercus, except obviously Quercus suber, are there any countries that you can import quercus from, or is it essentially banned to import?
Probably Sharon, you might want to come in here, but I do believe that whilst certainly, sorry, I'll leave it with you, Sharon. You'll probably be able to answer it all better than me.
As far as we're aware at the moment, there is nowhere in Europe which is meeting the pest-free areas. We're currently discussing whether an area in Italy can meet those requirements, but at the moment we're not aware of anywhere within Europe that can meet the pest-free area requirements. And in addition to that, there's the EU high-risk plant prohibitions, and quercus is on the list of high-risk plants and is therefore prohibited from all third countries at the moment, pending risk assessments. And those risk assessments will only be carried out if a third country makes an application to the EU to import the plants. So at the moment, there is probably very limited areas to where quercus can actually come from. Although bear in mind that Ireland has a pest as a protected zone as well, so plants could be moved from Ireland to the UK.
That's great. Thank you very much,
So
Sharon.
hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, really good. Thank you. Regarding Matthew's presentation, I should probably plug the BALI website at this point. We have a series of scenarios on the BALI website regarding plant passporting. If anyone wants any sort of clarification on the procedures they should take, how they should become authorised or registered, and I hope that's been sort of built in conjunction with the DEFRA team and particularly with Matthew, and I'm hoping you'll find that helpful. Okay then, thanks again to all of our panelists. If I hand over to Darren now to wrap up.
Yeah, thank you, Owen. So I'm just going to put my webcam just to end proceedings. So thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Apologies, it's run over sort of half an hour over, but I think we didn't want to stop the flow. I think there's 4 really detailed presentations there. The slides will be available to you all, and also the event has been recorded and will be available for a short time online. So you will get a chance to rewatch and perhaps pause on some of those slides where you want to extract more information, because understandably some of those were very, very detailed. Just before we do go, we have had another question come in, Owen, just for you, Matt, really. There's a question around obviously plant passporting. Someone's asking about what about the commercial contractors? So I'm assuming in the scenarios there was a lot about domestic gardens and maybe flower shows and things. I'm assuming, is there anything that commercial contractors should be aware of? So obviously plants moving between obviously being imported and then moving to commercial sites. Is there anything you can give by way of sort of pointers for that?
Certainly those plant movements need to be provided with plant passports. So essentially, if they're moving in from anywhere in Europe, certainly before the transition period ends, or from within the UK, they need to move to sites with a plant passport. And whoever is responsible for that movement needs to be the one who's authorised to issue them. Whether or not the commercial client themselves needs to be registered or not depends on whether or not they're doing anything with the plants. If they're planting them, if they're moving them themselves, then they need to be registered to do that, because they're professionally dealing with the plants, in which case you'll need to supply plant passports to them. If you're getting there and doing everything for them and they've completely contracted it out to you, then they wouldn't need to be registered because they're not professionally dealing with plants. Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. That's great.
I mean, I realise, my presentation was a lot of information. So if you do get more questions afterwards, please don't hesitate just to collate them and let me know.
We'll collate, and I think that's what we'll do just because of time, but we have got a few more, but I think some of the things may have been answered in the slides, but obviously because it was so detailed, so we'll have a look at some of those when we finish. But so I'm going to end it there. So thank you to Dagan, Matthew, Sandra and Sharon. I think all 4 of you deserve a round of applause. So there you go, everyone at home. Thank you so much for your time. And again, apologies to those watching at home or in their offices, etc., wherever they're based, for it overrunning. And have a good afternoon. Thanks all.
Thank you, Darren.
Okay, thanks a lot.